what we're going to be going over here is fixed overhead variance analysis, and we're going to be looking at it in terms of standard costing, and we're going to be laying these variances out here on a graph here to understand these different variances. So we're talking about standard costing and variance analysis. This is where we're comparing our actual results or actual costs for the period versus some standard or predetermined cost. Okay, so what we have to do here for this variance analysis, we really have to be looking at three different amounts here. So we're going to set up our standard or standard costing here, and that's going to be based on our fixed overhead that we're going to be looking at our standard on. And then based on our standard here, we're going to be having some actual results here for the period. And then knowing our actual results for the period and our standard that we have set or established here, we can set up what we call our flexible amount here on our flexible budget, and then we can compare our actual amount with our flexible amount and with our standard amount here. Okay, so first for our standard here, this is where you're going to determine some standard quantity here of fixed overhead. In our fixed overhead or overhead quantities and prices here are going to be based on direct labor hours. So total number of direct labor hours and for our product here, and we're going to be using that as our allocation base. Okay, so for our standard cost, we're going to have some standard quantity here, fixed overhead, times the standard price that we established for that fixed overhead. Okay, so that would be our standard cost, and then for our actual amount here, those would be the actual results for the period, and this is where we'd have our actual quantity here of fixed overhead costs versus our actual price, and this is all on a unit basis, on a per unit basis. So the actual quantity times some actual price is our actual results for this fixed overhead. And then knowing our actual results and our standard costs, we can set up our flexible budgeted amount. And that's really taking our actual quantity that we have here from our actual results and taking that actual quantity times the standard price from our standard cost here. So actual quantity from our actual results times the standard price here from our standard cost that we have here for that fixed overhead equals our flexible budgeted amount. Okay, so let's go and let's look at how we'd make our calculations here. So for this fixed overhead, really we're taking some quantity here. In this case, it's direct labor hours times some actual rate or rate here. So for our actual amount, it's going to be our actual hours used here based on our direct labor hours times the actual fixed overhead rate. Okay, so that's for our actual amount. For our flexible amount, this is where we're going to take the denominator hours. Really what those denominators are is DH. That stands for the total budgeted direct labor hours we have established for our product here for this our fixed overhead. Those are the total budgeted direct labor hours. So we take those DH or those total direct labor hours here times the standard fixed rate. Standard fixed rates come from our standard costing here. That's our flexible amount, and then our standard amount is going to be the standard hours allowed here for our fixed overhead for our products here times the standard fixed rate. Okay, so first for our spending variance, that's the difference between our actual and our flexible amount. And I've got everything color-coded here, but we really can't factor any, there isn't any common terms here that we can factor out between our actual and our flexible amount. So we simply, for our variance, we just take the difference. Those would be the actual hours used times the actual fixed rate here, that amount, and then we subtract or compare it to the standard fixed rate times those total denominator hours that we have. Okay, so that's for our spending variance. Now for our volume variance, that's between our flexible and our standard amount, and we have a common term here between both of those, and that's the standard fixed rate here. So we could factor that out. So simply our variance is the difference between those total denominator hours and the standard hours that are allowed here. So the denominator hours here versus our standard hours allowed, that difference times the standard fixed rate. So that's our volume variance. But really, what we're going to be looking at our volume variance, we're going to break that down into two separate other variances. It's going to be our planned production volume variance and our unplanned production volume variance. So this volume variance is going to be broke between those two. So for our planned production volume variance, that's going to be those denominator hours here. And what we're going to compare it to is the total budgeted direct labor hours for the product that that's going through the plant for this term here. So, and those would be the budgeted direct labor hours here for the production hours. Not the denominator hours are the total budgeted direct labor hours, but these are the ones that was what we set our fixed amount here for our direct labor cost. But our budgeted amount, those are going to be based on really the production requirements for the period here. So for our planned production, we have those total direct labor hours here. Compare it with our budgeted production hours, the BH here, this is production budgeted hours. So that difference times the standard fixed overhead rate here. And then our unplanned production, that's going to be the difference between those budgeted hours here, those budgeted direct labor hours, the BH hours here, and our standard hours allowed here, times the standard fixed rate. So what we've done here is we've just taken this volume variance and we've broken them down. We added in this other variable here, the budgeted direct labor hours that we have for the period here. And we broke that volume variance down. We added that in here, and we're just looking at breaking that apart here between our planned production volume variance and our unplanned production volume variance. Okay, so let's go down and let's look at our graph here. Okay, so what our graph here, I'm going to have our direct labor hours, our allocation base along the bottom here, or x-axis, and this is where we're going to have our labeled here, our standard hours allowed, and those are budgeted direct labor hours that we have here for the period. Then we're going to have our actual hours used, and that's shown in green here, and then we're going to have those total direct labor hours here that our fixed costs are based on. Okay, so those are the 4 points we're going to be looking at here. And then we've got two other lines here. We're going to have this applied standard line here. It's that green line here that has that increasing slope to it. And that's really the standard fixed overhead rate here, fixed overhead rate, times some direct labor hours. And that's going to be applied here to, based on the standard hours allowed here, those that's budgeted direct labor hours we have for the period, and also our denominator hours. And the other line we have here is a blue line. That's that standard fixed rate here. That's the standard fixed rate times those denominator hours, those total direct labor hours that we have established here for actually our constant fixed rate here. Okay, so we're going to have an intersection here between our applied standard here based on our standard fixed rate times the direct labor hours and our cost here. The cost remains the same. It's always the same fixed cost here regardless on the hours here, on the direct labor hours. It's constant fixed cost. So that's our fixed cost, and this is our applied standard, this green line. And then along our y-axis here, that's going to be our fixed overhead cost that we have. Okay, so I got a busy graph here, but let's just go and let's get into it real quick here. So what we want to look at is, first off, let's just look at the volume variance itself here. I'm just showing that here in green. And that's really the difference between our fixed cost here, that standard fixed cost times the total denominator hours here, and what we have here for those are, I'm showing the total, it should be here for this standard fixed times the standard hours allowed. It should match up with that amount here. So that's our total volume variance, and we'll go up to our chart and we could look at that. But that's just the difference between those total denominator hours here and the standard hours allowed. Total denominator hours, standard hours allowed, and we bring it up to our applied line here. And that's really what we're looking at, our intersection here between that applied standard here and our fixed rate here and those standard hours allowed. So that's our total volume variance. Now we have broken that down between our planned production and our unplanned production. Now, what I have here for the planned production, I'm showing it right here, this little amount. That's the difference between the standard fixed rate here times those total denominator hours and the standard fixed rate here versus times the budgeted direct labor hours for the period. So it's between those 2 points here. And you can go over here and you can look at it. That's that budgeted hours here, direct labor hours, versus our actual hours used here. Those are the 2 points, that intersection here, actual hours used versus that. And then our unplanned production volume variance is the difference between the standard fixed rate here and those budgeted direct labor hours here for the period versus our standard fixed rate here times the standard hours allowed here. That's our unplanned production volume. So it's really the difference. So we've got that volume variance here broken down between our unplanned amount, this portion here, and our planned amount up here. And the unplanned amount, if we gone down and look at it here, you can see it. That's the difference, the standard hours allowed versus those budgeted direct labor hours for the period based on our intersections here on our applied standard line. Okay, so that's it. The planned production volume variance, I have that down here, is those denominator hours, total direct labor hours that we have here versus the budgeted direct labor hours we need for the period. That difference times the standard fixed rate. But let's just look at this planned production variance. Really, if it's anything below between our green line here and our blue line, it's unfavorable because it's under applied. That's the only point I'm going to make for our planned production volume variance. Any amount in this range here, or when we're comparing it below the line here, and let's just make the comparison. So if I go over here past our intersection point here where our applied standard amount intersects with our constant fixed amount, our planned production volume variance, that's favorable because it's over applied. As long as any point here on our applied standard line here above our fixed line, then we have a planned production volume variance that's favorable. Any place on the other side, it's unfavorable. Okay, so I guess we made the distinction here between our unplanned and our planned production variances. Unplanned is this little area in here where we're looking at our standard hours allowed versus our budgeted direct labor hours for the period. That amount here, standard fixed cost times our budgeted hours versus our standard fixed cost times the standard hours allowed. That small amount here is unplanned production volume. This area here is the planned production volume variance. And the total variance was the difference between these points here, this point here and our point here, or standard hours allowed versus the direct total denominator hours. And then our spending variance, let's look at that. That's really the difference between our fixed amount here, that standard fixed rate times those total denominator hours here, and our actual cost. And our actual cost here is based on our actual usage here. And it's really comparing these 2 points here. This is the standard, well, the actual fixed rate here is different from our standard fixed rate. That's why we're going to have the spending variance. And spending variance is the difference between what we have here for our blue line here and what we have here for our actual cost here. That's really the actual fixed rate times our actual usage versus our standard fixed rate here versus our denominator hours. That was difference. Couldn't factor in it. It's just those total amount here. Standard fixed rate times these total denominator hours. That's the total direct labor hours we have. And between that actual fixed rate and our actual hours used here for the period. Okay, so that's our actual cost. That's spending variances between our fixed amount here, our constant fixed amount here, and our actual cost that we have. And that's only because our actual fixed rate is different from our standard fixed rate. Okay, so I guess I've got everything pointed out here in the graph. We could go back to our chart here and just make the comparison. So let's do that. Our unplanned production volume variance here, budgeted hours here versus our standard hours allowed times our standard fixed rate. And what did we have? That was this area right in here. BH, SHA here times the standard fixed rate, that amount. And then our planned production variance was that DH here, total denominator hours versus the budgeted hours here times the standard fixed rate. That's our planned production volume, and that was shown over here. Okay, well, that's shown here, excuse me. It's the standard fixed rate times those total denominator hours. That's that blue line here, that constant fixed amount here that we have budgeted versus our standard fixed rate times the budgeted direct labor hours for the period. So that's our plan. And then our spending variance was just that amount here. You can go, we'll go up there. Here was our spending variance. Actual hours used times their actual fixed rate, and that amount, then the difference between the standard fixed rate and those total denominator hours. Okay, so I guess pretty much we related, and then our volume variance, I guess we looked at that here. That was the DH, total direct labor hours that we have here for our fixed cost time and versus our standard actual rate here. It's the actual hours allowed times our standard fixed rate. So that was our volume variance right in here. All right, I guess so we went over our graph, we related it to our chart here, and then let's just finish up by going over and looking at our key amount here. So AF was the AF here stands for the actual fixed overhead rate. SF here in red was the standard fixed overhead rate. AHU was the actual hours that we used here. The actual based on our direct labor hours we're talking about. SHA in blue here is the standard hours allowed. BH, those were the budgeted hours for the budgeted direct labor hours here for the period. And DH was the total budgeted direct labor hours that we based our fixed cost on, and that was what they called the denominator hours. And really what we've done here is denominator hours here. We're really taking a look at our total fixed cost here divided by our total direct labor hours to determine our fixed overhead rates. And so the standard fixed rate would be what our total fixed cost that we set based on our standard, and then our total direct labor hours based on our standard. That would be our standard fixed overhead rate. And then the actual fixed overhead rate would be just what we had for our total fixed cost here for the cost here. FFC is our total cost here divided by our total direct labor hours, the actual amount in that case. Again, just so you understand, our standard fixed overhead rate is we're just taking our total fixed cost here, dividing it by the total direct labor hours, since we're basing our standard here on direct labor hours. And for actual amount was just based on the actual amount for both of those, and the standard fixed overhead rate was at that standard or that predetermined rate that we have for our total fixed costs and our total direct labor hours. Okay, so we went through our example here where we looked at our fixed overhead variances, and we specifically looked at the volume variance, and we broke it down between the planned production and unplanned production.